It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. While we were gone, the Republicans had a debate sponsored by Fox News. And I wondered if you could talk about your response to this.
I think the larger story is that it is what a bad situation the Republican Party is in. Just think about what's happened in the few days since last Wednesday's debate. Donald Trump is arrested. He's raising tons of money on his mugshot. Now, that seems to be an important national interest way to run for president. This party, which had no platform in 2020, is still captivated by this Trump cult. You had 6 of the 8 people on that stage say that if he were convicted of a crime and he were the Republican nominee, they'd still vote for him. The only 2 who didn't were Asa Hutchinson, who's a wonderfully nice man, but is never going to go anywhere, and Chris Christie, who I admire, but has the highest negatives among Republicans so high that he has no chance of the nomination. Look, I agree that Nikki Haley was good. She's the only Republican who scares me. I think the polling I saw showed that she did the best. But in the same poll that said she did the best, she got 4% against Donald Trump's 52%. And so does it really matter? Normally, in a situation like this, party leaders would say, we got to do something. There's a story today that starting in October, Trump's probably going to be in a civil trial that exposes that all his wealth is a fraud. He has a complete schedule of criminal trials next year. Chances are that he may be convicted on one of those counts, but not before the primaries and before he's the nominee. So you'd think that party leaders would step in and say, we got to do something. But most of them have been quiet. One who has opposed Donald Trump sent the National Guardian on January 6th and called on Trump to resign is Larry Hogan. And I think this opportunity for Governor Hogan to really assert himself as a leader in the party. If I had advice for Governor Hogan, I'd say quit playing with this fantasy of a third party with no labels. They're not going to win. And every bit of political evidence I've seen indicates that a third party candidate will help Donald Trump, he has very loyal voters. And here's what I'd do. I'd come back to Easton, to the Tidewater Inn, like Republicans did after the Carter victory in the 1970s. And if I were Hogan, I'd call other former governors like Charlie Baker or John Kasich and say, let's call a summit of Republican leaders. There are a bunch of current governors that they should get. Let's start with Chris Sununu and Brian Kemp in Georgia, Kim Reynolds in Iowa, Mike DeWine, Youngkin in Virginia, and I'm sure a whole bunch of others who are against Trump, and really try to create an anti-Trump beachhead in the Republican Party, an organized one. They'd get enormous attention. I'd do 2 things at this. I'd have the governors put out an actual platform to say, we're really going to run on something in 2024. We're not going to run in the cold of Trump. And secondly, I would have them then decide which of those other candidates they'd like to support. For example, if they got behind Nikki Haley, and then they went to all these other candidates and said, we saw what happened in 2016 when you had 15 candidates running against Trump. Let's at least give ourselves a chance by having one anti-Trump candidate. It may not work, but it has to be done soon. It has to be done before the early primaries because the Trump team is not stupid, and they've got control of the rules of the convention. And so if you don't beat him early, you're not going to beat him. If he gets the delegates, there's not going to be an unraveling at the convention because he'll have too much control. I think back to the Nixon impeachment and the role that Larry Hogan Sr. played. He was the first Republican to step out and call for impeachment. He's the only Republican in the House to vote for all 3 articles of impeachment. It cost him the governorship because he lost the primary that fall. But it gave him an honored place in history. I think that those were the words that Larry Hogan Jr., Governor Hogan, used in his second inaugural to talk about his father. Governor Hogan has the chance, I think, if he would take this leadership, to play that same role. Will it work? I don't know, probably. It's a long shot. But boy, this party needs a beachhead against Trump with some respected leaders. And I think Larry Hogan is among the most respected who could lead it.
Craig, how about that idea? Despite we wanting to welcome them at the Tidewater Inn again, you think that that could work?
Well, as always, Al is thinking big, and I believe he's actually absolutely right. It's exactly what we need. In my mind, the question is whether it occurs early, which would be most helpful in this cycle, or whether it occurs after the November election. And I wish I had more confidence in Republican leaders to step forward. So far, they've either gone the route of least resistance, which for the time for Larry Hogan is the no labels direction, or they've stay silent, or they just back Trump. So what I'm looking for and what I think I'm seeing are smaller steps that might lead to what Al is suggesting. And the smaller steps are kind of anecdotal, but more and more people willing to indicate that they're looking for a serious alternative. And by that, I mean, the fact that Trump is only in increasing amounts of trouble, and we now have some candidates who do look more attractive. It's almost giving permission to Republicans to say, I'm glad we're having this conversation. And I hear that a lot in this community from very kind people who watch this program and say, what you're saying, it reflects the way I think. And that didn't used to happen. People were staying silent on the question of whether they would go somewhere besides Trump. And therein lies, I think, the biggest threat to Trump, that thoughtful people are thinking about alternatives. Now, that actually opens a door for what Al is talking about, where politicians who are risk adverse to begin with, especially when it comes to their own career, don't want to step too far out on that limb for fear it breaks off. And so I don't know whether the climate is there yet. I wish I had more confidence that that was the case, but I do think it's a good thing that people are now willing to explore in the Republican Party these other choices. I only hope they do it early on, but that's what the primaries are all about. And I think what matters probably more than these national polls is what's really happening inside Iowa, what's really happening inside New Hampshire. Will a Chris Sununu endorse somebody in New Hampshire because the field has to narrow, to be sure. And once that begins to happen, I think there'll be even more of a shift away from Trump to some of the other candidates. Will it happen in time? If you had to ask me, if you ask right now, I think the Republican Party is more likely to lose the national election in November than win it. But with a strong candidate, that would change.
I guess where I disagree with Craig is that I think it's time to act big. Look, I've said this before because this is my deepest belief. Democracy is on the line in 2024. I was on a call yesterday with Miles Taylor, who wrote the book on the inside of the Trump administration, the first one, and uncovered plans for the second. And the plans for the second are basically to destroy our country, to help him, to get retribution. He has to be stopped. Of course, it's good to have individuals speak up, but Trump just rolls over that like it's water off a duck's back. I mean, that has no impact. Sometimes when the playing field is tilted against you, what good, skillful politicians do is create their own playing field. That's what they need to do. We could have sat back in 1985 after Mondale lost 49 states, or in 1988 and 89 after Craig and George Bush beat us up again, Michael Dukakis, but we didn't. We organized an effort and pulled people together who, by getting together, gave us strength. And that's what led the Clinton nomination and victory in '92. That's what you got to do. I'm reminded when we first started the DLC, we did a trip to North Carolina, and Paul Taylor, who at that time was the young rising star at the Washington Post political department, political writer, he said, here are a bunch of politicians who on their own couldn't fill a fire station, but together they have created a new force that's going to redefine the party. You have to do it early, because doing it after Iowa or New Hampshire is too late. Are the chances that it's going to work great? No. Trump has a real hammerlock on that party. But if nobody ever steps up, and if people like Larry Hogan continue to play footsie with a third party deal, which is almost certainly going to help Trump and go against everything that he has stood for his whole life if Trump wins. Where I come out, the bottom line is it's time for radical surgery in that party. It's time for the leaders of that party to step up and say they deserve to be one of the two great parties in America.
We have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you so much indeed. We will see you next week.